All right, everyone, welcome to week 4 of IBC 793, Intro to the Culminating Project. On our kind of guest lecture tour, today we have Stephanie Brenhofer with us. Stephanie, correct me if I pronounce your last name wrong. I realize I've never asked you how to pronounce it.
No, you're good.
I don't think you have, your mic's not on again, Stephanie, just as a heads up. But based on your nonverbals, I'm going to guess I got it right. Um, are other people having audio issues? I know Maria was requesting that, and I didn't hear Stephanie, but okay. Stephanie, the green icon in the top of your yellow bar again, or the icon with the microphone, you want that to be green.
It is green.
I can hear you now, so we're good.
Okay, good.
Okay.
Okay, awesome.
So we have Stephanie Brenhofer with us today. I have no idea what just happened to my chat box. Hold on, I will get one back. Okay. Adobe Connect is being weird today, apparently. Stephanie is our specialist in our research and evaluation kind of arm of the program, and is actively involved in a variety of different research projects and publications. She works closely with Dr. Roger Kessler, who will be coming and guest lecturing for you all in a few weeks. And particularly, and particularly, I was going to say, and who, sorry, brain not working, and who many of you have heard lectures from him thus far. And so over the course of the semester, some of the pre-recorded lectures that he's done. Before I hand it over to Stephanie, though, just a reminder, there is nothing due this week in class. But your assignment number 1, so your research plan and hypothesis form, is due next Sunday. I believe that ends up being Sunday the 10th. I'm sorry, no, Sunday the 17th. The 10th is this Sunday. We're going to review the rubric next week at the end of the class rather than at the beginning, because our guest lecturer next week, Dr. Manson, has a commitment a little bit later in the afternoon, so we'll make sure to let her present on her topic before we talk about assignment number 1 in more detail. But you really should be working to coordinate in your small groups this week. I know many of you have been talking through the hallway conversations. I did get confirmation from our program's web technician that she turned on the feature in Blackboard that should allow the group members to email each other directly. So you should be able to do that now if you want to give that a try, and if that's more kind of workable for you guys than trying to connect on the hallway conversation. So you should be able to send those direct emails now. I say this in terms of meeting in your small groups, very cognizant of the fact that we had our Houston area students impacted from a connectivity standpoint last week, and many of them still currently from Hurricane Harvey, and that Hurricane Irma is approaching our East Coast students. So we are understanding that that might be a challenge. Tammy says, if we have a hard time connecting with a time for all members of our group, can they hop onto another group? Maybe outreach to me if that's the case. I tried to coordinate your schedules or your groups based on time zones as much as possible. So I would imagine it would be challenging still with another group as well. That said, keep in mind that these small group meetings are really intended to give you guys an opportunity to connect and troubleshoot on project ideas before you submit something to me and the rest of the instructional team. If you look at the rubric, there's only 1 point associated with the group meeting, and it's based on your kind of reflecting on what that process looked like and how they helped you refine your understanding of things a little bit better. So you're not necessarily producing something as a group, and it is a fairly kind of small point total, though students have reported in the past that it's been really beneficial to be able to bounce some ideas off of people. But if you're having a hard time in that regard, let me know, and I can see if there might be an opportunity. do that, or if you have a group of 4 and you can do, 2 of you can meet at one time, 2 of you can meet at another time, that's fine by me as well. I know the groups range from 3 to 5. Yeah, so you can meet with the ones that you have connected with, Patty, if you're having a hard time connecting with everyone, especially I think in light of the hurricane situations right now. I'm cognizant that not everybody's going to be able to find a time that's workable for everyone. So before I hand it over to Stephanie, I see a little bit more typing, so I'll just field one question when it comes through, and then I will hand it over. Keep in mind, okay, getting on the road to get away from Irma. Well, that's good. I'm glad you're getting away from her in that regard. Keep in mind that your best way to prep for both your group meetings and the assignment is based on the materials located in the week 5 course content about the assignment. Lots of information there as well. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Stephanie. The same with last week, I'll be here and responding to text chat as people have questions, but I'm going to turn off my mic and camera so you don't hear my dog barking in the background anymore. So have a good one, guys.
Thanks, Colleen. Thank you, everyone, for being here for this. So today, I'm just going to talk you through the Lit Review portion of your culminating project. So when you start your Lit Review, the first thing that you should ask yourself is, what are you interested in or most passionate about? Because it's going to be a lot easier to write about something that you really care about versus any topic that you might come across. And another way to look at it is what could help you with future career goals, or even in the current field that you're in now, like where do you see a need for real improvement? So these are just some questions to ask yourself before you really hone in on a project or topic. Oops. Okay. So the first thing that you're going to do is read a bunch of articles. And if you're going to be reading a lot of articles, the best thing to do is to be organized in it, because there's really no way that you'll be able to remember everything that you read. So I would recommend keeping track of all of the search terms that you use and then the different search engines that you use. And then this will keep you from duplicating the same searches over and over again, and will hopefully save you time in the end. Another thing that you might like to do is to store all of your PDFs of the articles that you're interested in. And you can do this either in a folder on your computer. I personally store all of mine in a specific folder related to the manuscript that I'm working on Dropbox. But if you use different citation managers, such as EndNote, you can actually just save the PDF directly into EndNote, and then you'll have the citation and the PDF there. And then the next thing that I recommend that you do is that you form some type of table or way for you to summarize every type of article that you read. So I use an Excel document, and I keep a record of the important things that I think I will want to circle back to in the article, and then I have them all in one file, so if when I need to go back and actually write a literature review, I have everything in one place, and then that keeps me from needing to reread the article and prevents me from wasting any more time. So the goal of this literature review, and when I say literature review, I mean your initial search in the literature to figure out what your topic is. This is really going to help form your topic and subtopics. Things to consider as you're conducting your literature review is that you need to read and analyze every single article that you find. So just because a study is published doesn't actually mean that it's a good study or it's something that you should include in your literature review. So one thing that you can do to help hone in on finding good articles is to only read articles that are in peer-reviewed journals. So what I mean by that is most journals require that when an author submits an article that like 3 or 4 of their peers, so other people in the same field as them, has to read the article and then determine if it's worthy or not for submission. So if everybody gives a thumbs up that this is worthy of publication, then it gets published and it's free for everyone to read. So that's the first step in determining if the article is worthy or not. But that's not to say that all of those articles are still something that is still of merit. Sometimes articles slip through, maybe they shouldn't have, so you still need to be critical even with peer-reviewed articles and read them with a close eye to see if it's something that should go in your literature review. When you're reading articles, I know that it can be super tempting to read the abstract or to read the introduction and conclusion because those are more of the storytelling parts of the article and they're really easy to read, but you're really not going to get the information that you need if you only read those sections. If you're actually going to read only a couple sections of an article, the most important sections to read are the methods and the results because it's what the authors actually did. But I really recommend that you read it from start to finish because this is going to be extra helpful for you as you're learning about a new topic to read the introduction and the conclusion because it might make you aware of other type of studies out there that you might want to then follow up on and read later. So it's really important that you read the entire article and that you pay particular attention to conflicts of interest. So authors are required to report if they have any conflicts of interest, and you generally find them at the very end of the article. And it's not always a bad thing to have a conflict of interest, but it's definitely something to keep in mind as you're reading the article to determine if you think that conflict of interest really impedes on the results of that article. So next we'll talk about the different sections of the article. These are sections that most articles have, but not necessarily. But in general, there will be some type of introduction or background, methods and measures section, results, and then a discussion and or a conclusion. So the introduction or the background section really gives you a brief overview of all of the research that's gone on pertaining to the topic that the authors are interested in. So it really sets the stage for what is to come, why they conducted the study that they conducted. And in this section, researchers are citing other people's works. So it's really important that you keep this in mind because this is not the section of the article that you are going to be citing. So for example, if I write a manuscript and I cite something that Dr. Cordes wrote and you think, oh, that's like a really cool finding, I want to incorporate that into my literature review, you first need to find her article and you need to read it, and then because you want to make sure that I actually cited her correctly. Many times I've read articles and I've found that they cited other people's works incorrectly, so you definitely don't want to make that mistake. So if you're reading an introduction and you see an interesting finding and you want to follow up on it, you actually need to go to that article, read it, and then you cite that person's works, not the article that you originally started with. So you always want to make sure that credit is given where credit is due. And then another part of the introduction, usually at the very end, is where they're going to justify the purpose of their study. They might call it their objective, their aims, their research questions or hypotheses. It'll either be the last paragraph or last few sentences, but that'll help tell you what the article is going to be about moving forward. Okay, so the next section will be the methods and the measures. So this is where you're going to find all of the measures that they used, that they collected from the participants. Ideally, you should be able to take someone's methods section and be able to duplicate their findings. That's sort of the point of it, is to show that this is reproducible work. So examples of what you might find in this section are objective measures that they used. In terms of anthropometrics, that might be measured height, weight, waist, or hip, lab values, blood or urine to run various tests, or surveys that they collected on people such as like a depression or an anxiety screener. And then they're also going to mention the type of statistical analyses that they used, and then the type of statistical software program. And that's usually at the very end of their methods section. For the results, this is where the authors are going to convey their actual findings. So this is the section that you're going to cite that the authors did. So if you're reading a paper that I wrote, it's from the results section that you're going to say, Stephanie and colleagues, found this. So this is where you would be grabbing that information. And in general, most articles are going to have tables, figures, or graphs that they'll reference throughout. And these items should be standalone. You shouldn't need to read the text to understand them, but oftentimes that's not necessarily the case. But in general, I like to go to the tables and figures first, and I like to read them before I read the results section, just because they don't always necessarily match. They should match, but even in the results section, sometimes authors highlight the specific results that they want you to know in the results section. So they can't write everything that's in their graphs or tables. That would really defeat the purpose. So I like to go there first, and that's where I take my information. And it's really important to compare the two, because sometimes there are errors. There might be like a digit off or a negative sign where there shouldn't be in text versus the table. So you can also use this as a comparison, and you can have the tables printed out next to you, and you can be looking at the results section on your computer, and you can sort of match up the two and see if they go together or not. For the discussion and conclusion, so this part is where the authors relate their findings back to the literature. So again, you need to use caution when you cite in this section, because it's going to be partly what the authors of that manuscript found related to what authors in other manuscripts found. So just make sure that if I write an article and then you cite that I found something based on my discussion, that's actually what I found and not somebody else's works that I'm referencing. So this is really where the authors want to put their take-home message. Like, what are the implications of these findings? Kind of like the so what, like why is this important? Where will this take the field? And then where should the field go from here based on that person's findings? And then at the end, we'll generally talk about their strengths and limitations. And keep in mind that these are always according to the authors. It's not an exhaustive list. And I really encourage you to think about other types of limitations that are likely related to the study that the authors conducted that maybe they didn't disclose in their article. So transitioning now to the literature review table. So I mentioned before, it's really important to stay organized when you're conducting your literature review, just so you can help keep all of the different articles that you're going to read straight. So I recommend that you summarize every article that you read. And by summarize, just like a short little section on every single article. And develop a system that makes sense to you, but I've also outlined helpful pieces of information that I think it'll be important for you to collect. These are things that I collect at least. So obviously you want the citation so you can find the article again if you need to. You should really know the objective of this study. In terms of the population and sample, things that I think are important is the country the study was conducted in, the sample size, gender, age, race, ethnicity, anything that's going to be important for you to collect. Usually it's largely like demographic based that you think you'll need going forward with your literature review. I list the measures and the methods, so I might just list out, the names of the screeners. So, the PHQ-9, they used this, and then I'll just go forward. So then I know the measures that they're using to assess their various outcomes. Obviously, you'll want to keep track of the main findings because that's what you're going to be reporting in your literature review. And then any types of limitations or future directions. And keeping note of this might help you addressing the gaps later. Might help you justify why you're conducting the project that you're conducting. Okay, so this is just an example of a lit review table. This is just one article that I read related to shared decision making in primary care. And as you see, I have the citation, the objective, my population, the methods and measures they used, and then the results that I thought I would want going forward. So it's really important that you write the results section in your own words. And the reason I say that is because it's going to save you time and confusion later on. So oftentimes with this literature review table, I'll take the results and then I can just like plug them into a paper. So it's really nice because I don't have to think, did I actually say this? Did I copy this from the article? And then it prevents you from plagiarizing, which is important. So I really recommend you put that in your own words, and then it's actually going to save you time later on, and then you'll also be able to verify whether or not you really understood the article, because if you can't put their results into your own words, that should be a hint to you that you might not actually understand their results and what they've found. So in terms of actually writing the literature review, once you feel that your literature review table is in a place where you have enough information to write, I suggest that you start writing. And a good literature review will synthesize, not summarize your findings. And we'll get to this on the next couple of slides. But before I told you to summarize the articles that you're reading in your literature review table. But when it comes to actually writing your literature review, you're going to be synthesizing those findings. So in your literature review, it's really important that you stay organized and that you do this through topics and your subtopics with headings. So then we're able to follow what it is that you're writing and what you're talking about in each section, and that it has a logical flow. It's also important to use the 6th edition of APA, and then to really set up your literature review in a way that it leads right into your problem statement, your research questions, and your hypotheses, which will come directly after your literature review for your culminating project. So synthesis versus summary, what's the difference? With a summary, you're really addressing one article at a time, and that's why it's important for your literature review table. So since you're reading one article at a time and you want to remember what it is that article said, you want to summarize it. But in terms of actually writing your literature review, you need to synthesize, because we don't want a paragraph on every single study that you read. What we want you to do is to take the studies and combine them together. So if I read 5 articles that are talking about depression and diabetes, I wouldn't want 5 paragraphs on depression and diabetes. I would want 1, and I would take the findings that I found from those different studies, and I would figure out what are things that they agreed on, what are things that they disagreed on, did they have any similar findings, and then I really bring them together into a cohesive unit. Which sort of brings me to the next row on the table, is that you're condensing information from one source with the summary, but when you're synthesizing, you're really taking all of the information from your sources and you're bringing them together. In terms of a summary, you're really just regurgitating what the author already wrote in their paper, but you're just doing it in a more concise way, versus a synthesis, which requires you to really create something new, because you're taking works from different people and you're combining them in a way that hasn't yet been combined. In terms of the summary, you're really demonstrating that you just understand the material and what the authors wrote, but with a synthesis, you're articulating new insights into interpretation of the literature. Okay, so this is just an example of a summary. I'm not going to read it, but this should just be a visual way for you to see what it would look like to summarize one article. And that's why I have it highlighted in yellow, is that these are the findings from Albright and colleagues and nobody else. But on the next slide, this is what a synthesis would look like. There's works from various different people in this one paragraph. So for example, 2 different articles found that shoulder pain with disability occurs in 20% of the population. There's no need to say this twice. You would just say it once, and then you would cite all the studies that also found that. I'm looking at the chat now. Yes, like Mendeley is another good way for you to keep track of your PDFs. Really, whatever works for you is fine. So whether that's EndNote, Mendeley, saving them in a folder on Dropbox that you can access later, it really doesn't matter the way that you do it, just that you find something that works for you and you have a systematic way of tracking the articles, because you will cause yourself a lot of pain and frustration later on if you need to go back and hunt down all of the articles that you'd like to incorporate into your literature review. Okay. So in general, this is what your literature review should look like. So this is just a broad template. You're going to have a topic, and then you'll have 3 to 5 subtopics underneath that one topic. And then after you get done explaining each of your topics, you'll go on to compare and contrast your different subtopics. And then you will address the gaps in the literature. You'll go into your problem statement, and then you'll mention your research questions and hypotheses, which Dr. Manson will cover with you next week. So in terms of selecting a topic, obviously it needs to relate to integrated care, and you'll need to have one behavioral and one medical condition. So examples of behavioral conditions, and obviously these are not all-inclusive, but depression, anxiety, and PTSD can be potential behavioral factors to look at. And in terms of medical conditions, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, or asthma. It's important that your sources are current, so you want the most relevant articles pertaining to your topic. So you really aim for papers published within the last 10 years, and then you'll want the most current paper of whatever it is you're looking for that's been published within those 10 years. But you also may want to or need to cite seminal papers. So as you're going through the literature, it should become pretty apparent to you if there is a seminal paper or a few seminal papers in your field. And basically a seminal paper is sort of like the founding paper on a topic. So sort of like the paper that spurred a bunch of other papers. And generally these papers have thousands of citations, and they might be like 20, 30, 40 years old. So depending on what you're looking at, you may have a seminal paper that you should cite. And if that's the case, then many of the articles that you read will be citing that paper as well as justification for their studies. If you are so lucky to have somebody that's already conducted a systematic or meta-analysis on your topic, those are definitely important to read. So with a systematic review, somebody has systematically gone through the literature and reviewed every article that's relevant to that topic and has synthesized those findings for you. With a meta-analysis, they've done that, plus they've conducted additional analyses. So those will be important types of papers for you to review. So something to keep in mind when you're reading a systematic review is that you don't necessarily want to pick out the individual studies and then cite those. It kind of depends on what your purpose of using that is. So if you're using the systematic review in a way that, this systematic review shows that, X is really related to Y, and then you would cite the systematic review. But if you're just interested in like one little finding that they kind of mentioned throughout, then it's probably best for you to actually go to that article and then cite that article if you're only interested in that one little aspect versus what they're trying to say about an entire area as a whole through their systematic review. Because oftentimes they're conducted because there's sort of two schools of thought or inconclusive evidence perhaps on, if one topic is related to another. So if you'd really like to, talk about what the paper is saying as a whole, then definitely cite the review. But if you're only interested in, one little part of it or one study that they mention, it's probably best that you actually go to that study, read it, and then cite that study specifically. So once you have your topic selected, you'll identify 3 to 5 major questions or pertinent findings related to your topic. And then these questions are going to be what serve as your subtopics underneath your larger topic. And these subtopics should elaborate on key issues that have to do with your topic, and then you should be synthesizing the literature in each of your subtopics. So a clinical example for everyone on the clinical track might be diabetes and depression. So your first subtopic might be, does one cause the other? Does diabetes cause depression, or does depression cause diabetes? And this might be an issue you need to address. Subtopic number 2, are there higher rates of depression in patients with diabetes, or are there higher rates of diabetes in patients with depression? And the answer to these might be no, or they might not be. But you want to look at the literature and see, what information is out there related to these topics. Third topic might be, what are the consequences of successfully managing diabetes on depression, and vice versa. And then number 4, what are the guidelines about treating depression with diabetes? Has the CDC said anything? Has the American, Diabetic Association said anything? So that's something that might take a little bit more digging, that might not necessarily be readily apparent in the literature, but then again, it might also be. So different organizations will publish practice guidelines, and that might be something that you need to explore depending on the topic that you have. So for management students, a potential topic could be, PCP adherence to the CDC's recommendations on opioid prescriptions for chronic non-cancer patients. So your first topic might be, or subtopic is, in general, what are the current guidelines on opioid prescriptions for chronic non-cancer patients, or, if there are guidelines at all. Subtopic 2 might be, what are the barriers that PCPs face trying to follow these guidelines? And then the third might be, what are the consequences for strict adherence to the guidelines from, a patient outcome perspective. So after reviewing each of these subtopics, you want to compare and contrast them. So while they're sort of standalone topics, they're all sort of, they all relate back to your major topics. So you want to talk about, how intertwined are all of your subtopics. And then through this, you can identify issues that need further discussion. So going back to the clinical example, if you want to compare subtopic 3 with subtopics 1 and 2, it might look like this. So subtopic 3 was talking about the consequences of successfully managing depression or diabetes, and comparing that with subtopic 1 is, how would that affect causality? Subtopics 2, how could that change the rates of depression among patients with diabetes, or how could that change the rates of diabetes among patients with depression? And then with subtopic 4, which was looking at the current recommendations or guidelines on how to treat depression or diabetes, think about how that might affect being able to successfully manage either of these conditions. So do the guidelines and recommendations really match up with the best way to treat these people? In terms of the management example, so if we compare subtopic 3, which was, how could the consequences for strict adherence to the guidelines affect the ability of PCPs to successfully manage opioid prescriptions for these patients? Or how could strict adherence to these guidelines affect or add to the barriers that physicians perceive having due to the need for strict adherence? Okay, so in terms of gaps in the literature, you're going to need to justify the need to pursue your topic for your culminating project. And you're going to do this through gaps in the literature. So what we want to ask ourselves is, what will it mean for the field if we address the gaps? So it's really important to ask yourself the so what question in terms of what changes, in terms of practice or care or outcomes for patients, if I do this or if I do that. So we want to make sure that we're doing, meaningful contribution to the field that's going to advance it and move it forward. Okay, so a question came through. Would your management example be quantified by a survey given to PCPs? Are you talking about the barriers, or I'm not sure that I exactly understand what it is you're asking. Yeah, so an easy way to figure out if there are barriers, you could technically do a focus group. So oftentimes qualitative data will center around barriers, or barriers will be done through qualitative data, just because it might not necessarily be readily apparent what the barriers are, and it's just easier to get a bunch of people in a room to talk about what the barriers are. And then once you have a better idea of what the barriers are from that focus group, then it might be more appropriate for you to then construct a survey that you distribute to a variety of primary care physicians. So it definitely could be through a survey that you could collect that information, or some type of focus group. So if you're not sure what the gaps are in the literature pertaining to your topic, there are some questions that you can ask yourself. So the first being, has your topic been looked at in other populations but not the population that you're studying? So if, for instance, you're really interested in diabetes and depression in emerging adults, but most of the research is done on elderly individuals, that could be a gap. That could be justification for why you need to do the research that you're doing. Another one could be, is there a consistent but important piece missing from the majority of research that you've been reading in your specific area? So that could be like a research design or methodology based. So if most of the research is cross-sectional and you really think, wow, like we really don't know longitudinally what this could mean, that could be a gap in the literature that you need to address. Or in terms of methodology, let's say that everyone is asking people their heights and weights, but it's super important for your topic that they're actually measured, because measured heights and weights are much better than asking people how tall they are and how much they weigh. So like that could be a gap. So things like this, pay attention to what you're reading, how researchers are collecting their data, and these are things that you can put in that limitation section in your table that you can then circle back to and realize, wow, this is really a gap in the literature that I think I could address. So your literature review should then lead into your problem statement. So you need to indicate what your problem is regarding your chosen topic and why you're conducting the research that you're conducting. So you need to think about, how many people live with this condition? How much does it cost to have X amount of people living with this condition? What are the methods that have been tried and have previously failed or just been inadequate, not really lived up to the standards that they should? And then what is needed moving forward? So these 4 things you're going to see in the example on the next page that I address all of them, because that really sets the stage for why we need to do the research that we need to do. So in this example, despite the vast array of research conducted on diabetes and depression, X amount of people in the U.S. suffer from diabetes and depression, which costs, X billions of dollars a year. Several methods have been identified to help lower hemoglobin A1C levels in those with diabetes, while even more therapies have been recommended for those with depression. However, no effective treatment measures or methods have been shown to help those with both. So I start off saying, how many people this affects, how much money this is going to cost each year, that there have been other methods that have been tried and failed, and then what we need to do moving forward. And that's going to be important for you to set up your problem statement similar to that in your own CPs. So after your problem statement, this is when you're going to form your research question hypotheses, which Dr. Manson will go over with you next week. And then after your literature review is complete, you can actually use that information to form your AIMS page. So I just have a template for a specific AIMS page, and your AIMS page should just be one page. So it really forces you to concisely convey the information that you need to, and there's really a lot that you need to put on this one page. So it's really an exercise of synthesis and really getting the important information across in one page. So this template is available to you as you all form your specific AIMS page. So ASU also has writing resources available, so I really recommend that you take advantage of this resource as it's free to students. While they're not going to, heavily edit your paper, they can definitely help you fine-tune your writing skills and get better at writing over time. So that's it. This is my adorable puppy Milo, and now you all get to see him and his happiness on a boat ride, and I can answer any questions that you have.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. Great. Yeah. Questions, comments, concerns? I agree too.
Thank you, Melissa.
When Stephanie sent me the copy of her slides to upload, I commented on how adorable the dog was. I feel like my dog would be equally as excited to be on the boat. So.
He had a good time.
See a little bit of typing going on. Awesome.
You're welcome. I'm glad that it was helpful.
Great. So as Stephanie mentioned, Dr. Manson is going to be our guest lecturer next week, and she's going to help you start thinking about, you've been looking at the literature, you've been identifying some of those gaps. So how do we kind of take some of your ideas and translate them into a potential research question or kind of more narrow or focused CP idea, which is the kinds of things that you'll be doing for assignment number 1. I know there's a little bit more typing going, but once we have answered all of the questions that you guys have, we'll wrap for today. We're a little ahead of schedule, but we've gone over the last few ones, so give you some minutes back, some time back. Okay, so Robelin said, I mentioned that management students can utilize pre-existing data, for the example, the CDC. So we've not had anyone do a meta-analysis or kind of a larger meta-analysis for their projects, because that's a little bit more robust than we train you guys to do realistically. I would recommend you talk to your advisor if you have a specific idea about the feasibility for your interest area in general. But typically my response is going to be no. Normally we want to see, if you're using pre-existing data, to see you do some sort of new or unique specific statistical analyses on that topic or on that data set. So if you scroll all the way down, Stephanie, I thought I had uploaded it. If I didn't, I'll redo it now. I know I swapped out some slides earlier. I'll do it right now if it's not there. Normally it's attached to the task, but if it's not there, it'll be there at the same time that I post the webinar link, which will be momentarily. Emmett, those are good questions for your advisors in that regard. That might be, I don't have an answer for you in that regard specific to that. The other faculty member to talk to about international work, particularly in Asia, would be Dr. O'Donnell. He does some work there. So, or not specifically in Japan, but there. Can a medical for literature review, I'm assuming you're saying, can the medical outcome for your literature review be somatic? I'm not, I don't know if you're saying like somatization or something along those lines. Somatization is not quite the level of medical outcome that we would want to see, although it can be quantified through things like the PHQ, I think it's 14, 15. So typically we encourage it to be some sort of data point that might exist in the EHR as an example, all of them. Okay, we'll talk more about those specific kinds of specifics next week when we talk about honing your project ideas a little bit further. But in the interim, thank you so much, Stephanie, for your time. I really appreciated this, and I know our students did as well. And have a good week, everyone.
All right, thank you. Thanks for having me, Colleen.
Of course.